Both leftists and rightists have observed that the far right is victorious in internet and social discourse. Hasan Piker declared that the left has lost the debate, and most of the new generations are trending rightward. This has caused them to attempt to diagnose the reasons for this shift. Most often I hear condemnations of the character of young people, that they've become hateful, that they're edgy and living out juvenile fantasies, or they're stuck in quote-unquote echo chambers caused by algorithms, and worst of all, that they're just outright ignorant. But I don't think any of these answers are satisfactory. For example, ignorance can't be the cause of this rightward shift. People are indeed seeking political information. That's the reason why there can be any such rightward shift, because a shift in political ideology requires knowledge about that ideology. One might be able to say that they're seeking the wrong information. One cannot accuse them of simple ignorance. We have to explain why they're seeking that quote-unquote wrong information in the first place. The accusation that young people are hateful is questionable because I don't see any reason why today's generations, which are raised in an overwhelmingly liberal power structure to generally tolerant parents, should be especially more filled with hate than those that preceded them. Perhaps they might be edgy, but communism has at least as much potential to be edgy as white nationalism does, considering that in relation to liberal society, it is as quote-unquote extreme as its opposition, if you forgive me for using that loaded term. Finally, the claim that quote-unquote echo chambers produce far-right politics has various issues. The first being that all the mainstream platforms no longer allow explicit far-right content, and so the right-wing content that they do find is usually of a more liberal nature, such as Tim Pool, Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, or Jordan Peterson. If this echo chamber produced anything, it would be more fiscal austerity and colorless patriotism. But that's obviously not the kind of political shift that leftists are talking about when they use the outdated term alt-right. The second issue is that people are not passive consumers of information. People will actively seek out what they want to hear, and if they want to hear right-wing narratives, then they will seek out right-wing content. Leftists have to explain why there is this right-wing desire in the first place, and that cannot be the result of an echo chamber. The third problem is that companies have already addressed this issue. YouTube regularly recommends to me leftist content and content from mainstream news sources. They've even put info blurbs about the Holocaust or gay conversion therapy, along with links to left-biased Wikipedia articles underneath videos on these subjects. Algorithms are now designed in such a way as to actually de-radicalize people, so this concern is largely outdated, if it even ever was accurate. If we want to explain the rightward shift, then we have to look to more fundamental reasons why the left is losing the debate. I can't accept that it is a character flaw because the left declares that anyone who doesn't accept leftism has a pathological personality. And in that case, they've already conceded that they cannot win discursively and must instead resort to repression. I don't think that's a particularly productive nor convincing argument in favor of leftism, especially because it prevents them from figuring out how they might be able to convince intelligent people to turn away from the right. It's a kind of fatalism, one that is as politically disastrous as declaring that American voters are deplorables. What appears to me, and sure, this is just polemics, but I find that the left fails to seriously justify their political beliefs at a fundamental level. There's a profound lack of theory among popular leftist content creators like Vaush or Hasan Piker. They're stuck at what I call political discourse level 1, which consists only of polemics and party politics. Simple oppositions that reinforce the in-group and disparage the out-group, such as when Vaush calls poor white people from red states ruraloids against the Democrat voting urbanites. It's an emphasis on mainstream day-to-day politics and political identifications that almost completely ignores rationality and principle, so it's no wonder why I don't find any concrete justification of their worldviews in their streams or videos. It might just be my lack of knowledge because maybe there are a handful of small leftist channels that focus on the intellectual foundations of leftism, but I haven't found them, and they certainly do not get promoted. Even if such channels did exist, I never find any serious left-wing critiques of right-wing principles. What I mean by this is that whenever leftists identify a feature of right-wing politics, they never interrogate its actual justifications, or worse, they only attack a straw man of the right's ideal. For example, we might think of feminist critiques of patriarchy as an attack on a fundamental value of the right, but they don't address the arguments that the right actually makes for it. Instead, they argue that patriarchy is a power structure based on reinforcing the self-interest of powerful men. And in other words, that it is just a question of power relationships rather than a question of values. They reduce religion and metaphysics to the same question of power. The relationship between man and God, in which man must be subordinate and unquestioning, is just a mask for the true intentions of power actors who wish to oppress women for their own benefit, claiming that the principle of holy submission is just a tool used by men to impose their stereotypes upon women or to impose their authority on others in general. Neither do they take seriously the fact that rightists claim that patriarchal authority is righteous because it is revealed and thus morally real. This causes a problem because non-European religions have similar revelations, and it is held that we ought to respect the right for non-European cultures to express themselves free from European oppression. Other cultures are granted a relative absolutivity that European culture is not, and it constitutes a serious blind spot for the power analysis. But moreover, the actual question that the left should be addressing isn't the validity of these power relationships, but rather whether the philosophical justifications for revealed religion are valid. That is the actual principle behind traditional gender normativity, not merely a Machiavellian power relationship. Accusing your opponents of Machiavellianism is bad intellectualism. To assert that a person would subscribe to an ideology but not subsequently believe in the truth of its claims is bad practice. It's fair to say that we actually do see instances of this in society, but if we want to have a high standard of intellectual rigor, we must address the best version of arguments. A philosophical investigation of Platonism would have to start with the arguments Plato uses to justify the forms, for example, and then proceed on to discerning whether his society in the Republic reflects his prior philosophy, and whether his society would be invalid if we could find an argument against Platonism. It would be irresponsible to declare that Plato was just a servant of authoritarianism and simply formulated his arguments to quash democracy, which was on the ascendant during Plato's lifetime, as Karl Popper does in The Open Society and Its Enemies. He does the same thing to Hegel as well, arguing that Hegel's philosophy of state was just propaganda for the Prussian government. I see this style of argumentation all the time on the left, and it's a symptom of an overall larger problem, which is that the left just doesn't care about justification at all. The reason the left loses the debate is because it has no apparent foundational arguments. Because it does not delineate how their sociological and political views are justified, it cannot attack the justifications of its right-wing opponents. To oppose right-wing justifications, the left needs a lens through which they can see those justifications in the first place, and that lens consists in their own justifications. All political debates are essentially debates over the justifications of worldviews. What does reason or nature imply about what sort of political organization is the best? What is justice? And from that definition of justice, what kind of society originates? What epistemic foundation do we begin from such that we can ascertain knowledge about the elements of the political? What are the foundations of our ethical views? Leftists usually do not answer these fundamental problems and questions. Leftism does have theory, but it often strains to actually justify and apply that theory. As Giovanni Gentile pointed out, Marxism is based on an idealist philosophy, but it denies that idealism while relying on it. Historical materialism is based on Hegel's dialectics, but his dialectics requires a spirit or mind to unfold. Marx gets rid of the spirit, but continues to declare that dialectics is the law of nature and social life. Dialectics, then, is driven by nothing or everything, and so it exists without any real justification. How can you convince someone that communism is the inevitable outcome of capitalism if you can't explain to them how this process of class conflict operates in the first place? In other cases, the application of Marx's theory is complicated by the outcomes of history that Marx did not predict. The only way out is to engage in what Popper called vulgar Marxism, which is simple moralizing against the bourgeoisie and in favor of the proletariat, ignoring that Marx thought capitalism and bourgeois property were actually rather progressive in the grand scheme of history, and as such were a necessary stage before communism could develop. Any way you look at it, the left fails to really justify the Marxist worldview. Then there is the gaping hole of leftist ethics. What is the basis to declare that oppression is wrong or that freedom is desirable? What basis do we have to suppose that bourgeois property and the bourgeois mode of organization in general is immoral? Leftists take these moral propositions for granted, assuming that everyone wants anarchy, democracy, social permissiveness, and freedom as much as they do. If you don't want these things, then there must be something pathological about you. Maybe you're educated wrongly, or you're just a rotten person who wants to dominate others. Because they assume character flaws, they hand-wave away the task of defending and justifying these values, which means that they cannot ever convince someone who's looking for a rational argument that leftist ideals are worth following. If I wanted to steelman the ethics of the left, I would say that it's simply a continuation of the liberal Enlightenment, as Engels implies in The Origin of the State, the Family, and Private Property, perhaps also inspired by Hegel's notion that men derive freedom from spirit. I've already done a lot of work arguing against liberal ethics on this channel, so I won't belabor this discussion. Liberalism already consists of several unjustified beliefs, such as the universality of humanity or the presumption that people are individuals. What does the left have to say about this? And in fact, we could go even further and note that Marx disagreed with liberal individualism, which he called bourgeois individualism, and critiqued the French rights of man as bourgeois since they maintained a system of exploitation. Marx's conception of the individual is that his consciousness forms out of material relationships, not that men self-determine what they are. Because of that, the ethics of the individual are bound up with the ethics of production, but the ethics of production are not much elaborated on beyond Marx borrowing the idea of alienation from Hegel. It is ironically the right that have extended the critique of capitalist ethics further through critical value theory, which posits that value itself inculcates moral principles in society, such as cupidity, as well as the idea of the fungibility of humans. It remains to be said that if we propose human liberation as the highest good, we need to have a foundational justification for this belief. And yet, despite hours of listening to and reading leftists, I haven't found a single one of them identifying a foundational reason why we ought to strive for liberation, other than that it is necessary. We then have the absurdity of postmodern oppression morality, which is generally accepted by today's leftists. They argue that all social reality is socially constructed, and as such, no singular construction can be any more or less valid than all the others. And yet they've devised a form of morality which declares those structures that oppress to be invalid, while those of the oppressed remain valid and must be defended. I haven't heard a single leftist justify this oppression morality, nor explain how it can be consistent with the claim that all social constructions are valid. If you cannot justify your worldview, then you're just ceding the conversation to the right, who will usually appeal to natural law as a basis, which at least provides a basic belief that isn't merely an infinite regress or an appeal to vague moral sentiment or mere necessity. Even if they don't appeal to a religious concept, the right can still form an empirical justification for the way they want to order society. The rightist conception of human nature has deep roots in biology and genetics, but the left fails to come up with a similarly rigorous system of evidence for their belief, or faith rather, in human equality. Egalitarianism is itself an unjustified assumption, which is easily called into question by observation and lived experience. It is perhaps the most implausible idea that the left presents, because what we know about psychology and natural selection indicates decisively that mental traits are under selection pressure. Leftists hold on to Darwinian evolution and to sociological human nature simultaneously, and never interrogate whether this set of beliefs is compatible. It's confusing because leftism could totally work with a Darwinian account of mental traits, even the belief that intelligence is largely determined by heredity. We can easily imagine a society where people who have less intelligence are granted resources by society to compensate for their inability to perform complex labor. But the problem is that the left's entire ethical belief is contingent upon an assumption of absolute human equality, which is perhaps how they arrive at the normative claim that domination is unjustified. But either they propose a system of social justice, which is entirely unjustified, or they argue for egalitarian conditions which are, on the basis of the assumption of human equality, also unjustified. It's not as though the left is incapable of the task, they just don't want to do it for some reason. On the left, many have observed what they call the libertarian to alt-right pipeline. YouTuber Aaron Isaac made a video on this subject or something like this subject 5 years ago, where he claimed that this form of radicalization occurs for two reasons. One, the algorithm feeds more and more quote-unquote extreme right-wing content to viewers once they watch mainstream right-coded content. And two, the quote-unquote alt-right uses tactics to lure vulnerable people into adopting their beliefs. I've already commented on why the echo chamber's argument is invalid, but the phenomenon of mentally vulnerable people adopting fringe political ideologies for psychological comfort actually seems pretty marginal. Most right-wing people I know are reasonably well-adjusted, and the reason that they hold their beliefs isn't because it brings them comfort. They just believe that the arguments are true. Treating people as though they are completely devoid of will and reason is obviously questionable. You will find that the only former far-right people who exist are those mentally fragmented souls who were never into politics for any rational purpose anyway. If social belonging and comfort is your goal, it's much easier to be a left-wing than right-wing because most of society has left-leaning beliefs, and you'll have a much easier time socializing and making friends. This is in fact an argument leftists often make to supposedly demonstrate why the right is toxic, as though a political ideology not being socially convenient at the moment is a great disproof of its principles. But the real reason why there is such a thing as a libertarian to alt-right pipeline is just because the discourse of the right is more elaborate and much superior to that of the left. What happens in the pipeline is that people get acquainted with and convinced of certain arguments. For example, the libertarian argument that self-ownership is absolute and that we could build a whole moral system in society based on it, and the consequent non-aggression principle. Then people are exposed to contrary arguments, such as the argument that capitalism cannot exist without a state, or that the stateless society inevitably centralizes and cannot defend itself against ideological subversion. There is also the problem that a stateless society would have trouble preventing harmful immigration, which then sets libertarians on a journey to learn about immigration and human differences. Then after becoming aware of this discourse in biology, it has the effect of creating a far-right shift insofar as the person is convinced by the data and arguments. This pipeline cannot exist if people are just passive consumers of information. It is a long and arduous process of dialectics, exposure to arguments and counter-arguments. There's also a path no one talks about, one that I followed, which is the libertarian to reactionary pipeline, which generally starts with Hans Hermann Hoppe and his book Democracy, the God That Failed, and goes through Bertrand de Jouvenel's On Power, and then on to thinkers like Thomas Carlyle and Julius Evola. We can trace a specific intellectual path through various books and speakers that convinces, not lures, people to adopt right-wing ideas. But the left cannot point to any similar phenomenon on its own side. I don't see anyone reading A Theory of Justice, then getting interested in socialism and reading Marx, then going on to read Lenin, Stalin, or Bakunin. In fact, I don't see leftists reading much theory in general. Leftism spreads through social osmosis, implying the action of pressure and conformity, rather than through intellectual argumentation. As such, the liberal to communist pipeline functions completely differently to right-wing pipelines, and as a result, leftists cannot understand how the right-wing pipeline functions. And most consequentially, the left often fails to produce more intelligent leftists out of the potential stock of persons because it has such a lack of intellectual argumentation, nor any genuine way in which its arguments compete or lock together. The right's intellectual sphere is so integrated, both in the sense that it meshes together and also that its ideas are in direct conversation and competition with each other, that one book basically leads into another. But the left's intellectual world is comprised of very discontinuous and even politically substanceless philosophers. For example, Michel Foucault is heavily influential on the left, but he never advocates for nor argues for any positive ideological outlook. He mainly writes about the history of social systems and institutions, as well as their power relationships. Foucault might have the effect of convincing a person to be skeptical of power, but it doesn't lead into any particular ideology. In fact, I've seen just as much right-wing use of Foucault as I've seen left-wing use. This is to such an extent that some leftist intellectuals have accused Foucault of being a reactionary because he seemed to compare the classical world favorably to the world of the Enlightenment. He denied that this was true, however. In other cases, leftist philosophers are deliberately vague and evasive. Derrida's method of deconstruction is more of an art than a science, and it can be applied by anyone for any purpose, since it's basically just a sort of critical analysis of text. And as for the path from liberals to communists, it's complicated by the fact that liberals have so much tied justice to market values and self-interest that there's also very little in the way of leftist introspection of this theme in the English-speaking world, although there's quite a bit of discussion on this in France. It doesn't seem to have caught on, however, since it upsets the alliance between liberals and leftists, which is generally perceived as politically beneficial and progressive. The purpose of this video isn't to score points against the left. I actually want to see the left build a discourse which is just as compelling and interesting as that of the right. I think their ideologies present a picture of a future which is, at least in some domains, quite compelling, but they need to really do the basic groundwork of justifying it before intelligent people will start adopting it. I'm literally a single argument away from becoming an anarchist, for example. I've been looking for the one argument that will change my mind, the one counter argument that will completely demolish my right-wing principles once and for all, but I never find it. I'm open-minded and willing to be convinced of just about anything as long as someone has a good argument. But unfortunately, I never see a competent effort at this from the left. I can't be alone in this assessment because Hasan Piker basically agrees, and most of the left seems to admit that they have completely lost the discourse. The fact that platforms have resorted to just banning and censoring the right implies that they don't believe the left can sufficiently convince people. If you don't have an argument, then all you have is force. If the left actually did some introspection, they might arrive at beliefs which are more elaborate and consistent than the modern stereotype that characterizes the left, which is basically more liberal than it is leftist. I explained this in my video on Jean-Claude Michéa, who has very much the same opinion I do on this matter. Political correctness, moral browbeating, and having all of society's capital can only take you so far in the argument. If you don't have any actual justifications, you're going to let a lot of intelligent people become far right.